Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tates, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather this evening is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate both in person and virtually the launch of Medicare's Histories, Origins, Omissions, and Opportunities in Canada, published by the University of Manitoba Press. Thank you all for joining us here in person. Thank you to everybody who is joining us virtually on YouTube. Just a few quick housekeeping notes for myself before we get underway. Tonight will consist of a set of presentations from the podium, followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions. During the Q&A, those present here, we ask that you please just raise your hand, say your question out loud, and your host will then repeat the question into this microphone for the benefit of all those watching at home. With that in mind, I would ask you to keep your questions relatively succinct to ensure that all that information can be stored. Rest assured, there will be ample opportunity to further interrogate tonight's participants when you get to the signing table later on. If you are watching on YouTube, please feel free to write your question into the chat, and we will put it to our panel as time permits. We ask that while you're located physically in this space, that you keep your masks on. You'll notice that some folks who end up behind a microphone will remove their masks at that point. Once you actually leave the space for the book signing, at that point, masks are recommended, but not obligatory, although we do strongly recommend them. And with that in mind as well, at the end of the event, we ask that you just all remain in your seats for one moment while we move your panel over to the table so they may sign books for you at the end. That is more than enough for me right now, so I will just introduce tonight's host. Your host for the evening, Dr. Nathan Mccullum, is an Associate Professor of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba, Interim Director and Research Scientist at the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy, and Scientist at the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nathan Mccullum.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thanks to everyone who came in person and those of you who are coming online to be part of this wonderful book launch. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to be able to learn about the history of Medicare and to hear the stories that are often overlooked and are not part of common knowledge around the history of Medicare here in Canada. As an American citizen, I grew up looking with envy up to Canada for its publicly funded healthcare system, but we do get a very biased and sanitized view of what healthcare looks like as American citizens, and coming up here to Canada, it's been quite an eye-opening experience. And so I'm looking forward to learning more with you this evening. I'd like to introduce our panel to you tonight. They will be sharing in the order in which I introduced them. First, we have James Hainley, who is a professor of history at the University of Winnipeg and the former chair of the department. He is the author of Healthy Boundaries, Property, Law, and Public Health in England and Wales, 1815 to 1872. In 2020, Professor Hanley was the recipient of the Robin H. Farquhar Award for Excellence in Contributing to Self-Governance for his commitment to equity and governance and for his role in facilitating initiatives that directly impacted Indigenous representation. We also have with us Delia Garvez, who is an associate professor in the history department at the University of Winnipeg. She specializes in the history of the mind and brain sciences and is particularly interested in theories of consciousness, professional identity, surgical practice, epistemology, and medical training, especially as these pertain to the first generations of neurosurgeons. She is currently writing a series of biographical essays about the Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield. Esyllt Jones is the Humanities Research Professor in the Faculty of Arts, University of Manitoba. She writes and teaches about the history of disease and public health, pandemic influenza, and socialized healthcare. Her books include Influenza 1918, Disease, Death, and Struggle in Winnipeg, and Radical Medicine, The International Origins of Socialized Healthcare in Canada. She is a member of the Royal Society of Canada's COVID-19 Task Force. And finally, we have Mary Jane Logan McCallum, who is Professor of History at the University of Winnipeg and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous People, History, and Archives. Her research interests focus on modern histories of Indigenous people, especially in the area of health, education, and labor. Her current projects center on Indigenous histories of tuberculosis in Manitoba, family and community-based histories of Munsee Delaware Nation. And so first I'm going to invite Professor Hanley to come up and share with us today.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks to all of you for attending, either here or wherever you may be. I would like to say a bit about what led to this volume, and my remarks are taken from our introduction to it. This project arose out of our interest in addressing a puzzling historical silence about Canadian Medicare and a corresponding lack of public or political commemoration of its creation. You can read more about the historical analysis of Medicare in the book, but for tonight, I will focus on the lack of public or political commemoration. Governments have rarely emphasized Medicare's place in the story of Canadian nationhood. Although it is a highly valued social program and key to Canadian national identity, especially in our perceptions of difference from our dear neighbors to the south, the birth of Medicare received little public attention or effort at commemoration. In a prepared statement to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage in October 2011, then Conservative Minister of Heritage James Moore announced the Harper government's priorities for commemoration. He had already announced a super commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, but in 2011, he revealed a further list in the runner-up to what would come to be called Canada 150. The usual signposts of the development of the settler colonial state were present, but rarely any contestations of it. Thus, the establishment of a colony at Red River was highlighted, 200 years in 2012, but not the Red River resistance, 150 years in 2019. The two world wars featured in quite specific ways, including particular battles and regimental anniversaries, but there was nothing on the draft riots or the internment of Japanese Canadians. The remainder of the list hardly inspired much confidence in the possibility of a critically engaged history of Canada. It included the 100th anniversaries of the Grey Cup and the NHL, as well as the 25th anniversary of NAFTA. Oops. A rare progressive item on the list was a brief mention of women's suffrage, but the concurrent denial of Indigenous suffrage was not mentioned. The 50th anniversary of the passage of the Medical Care Act in 1966, the statutory foundation of federal Medicare, was absent altogether, as indeed was any mention of a social safety net. Delia, Esyllt, and I came together in the summer of 2017 to think about this relative silence and to reflect on how we could shift Medicare from background to foreground. We chose to host a symposium in 2018 on the 50th anniversary of the birth of Medicare, because although it took several years for all programs and territories to join, 1968 marked the implementation date of the Medical Care Act, delayed from what had hoped to be a highly symbolic beginning on July 1st, 1967. Our goal Our goal was to deliberate on what was and is possible in healthcare by discussing aspects of healthcare history from home care to nursing professionalism to childbirth to activism by people with disabilities, to name a few of the topics that this collection addresses. We were convinced that there were new stories that needed to be told about the history of Medicare. We did not envision the symposium as merely a commemoration. And in an email to participants, we invited them to reflect on Medicare's limits as an instrument of health equity and to explore the strengths and weaknesses of publicly insured health services from the perspective of race, gender, ability, and sexuality. Delia will have more to say about the contents of the volume, but let me conclude by thanking the individuals and institutions who made this volume possible. The symposium on which this volume is largely based could not have taken place without the generous support of the University of Winnipeg History Department via the H. Sanford Riley Fellowship in Canadian History, a generous endowment given to the department by the university's former chancellor and keen supporter of Canadian history, Sandy Riley. Essential support was also provided by the University of Manitoba History Department, St. John's College at the University of Manitoba, and the University of Manitoba Press. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to read from the introduction to give you a brief overview of the broad themes of the book. And I want to start by saying how grateful the three co-editors are to the leading healthcare historians, one of whom is here today, you'll hear from her soon, who responded with such enthusiasm to our call to engage critically with Medicare's past and present. Medicare's Histories highlights the lost opportunities that beset Medicare from its inception, from the exclusion of Indigenous people and the violation of treaty rights, to the failure to incorporate dental care and pharmacare, to the neglect of broader social determinants of health. Medicare has been an imperfect project, one that needs more work. To help illuminate how the contributors to this volume bring new insight into Medicare's evolution, we have organized the chapters into 3 sections based on the themes that are evident in the subtitle of the collection: Origins, Omissions, and Opportunities. We hope that you, the readers, also find your own connections and intersecting ideas among the chapters. The first part of the book is about origins and alternative visions. In Canada, a distinctive set of factors forged what is commonly called Medicare from a provincially variegated mix of public and private separate contributory hospital and medical care programs into a federal provincial cost-shared, largely tax-funded system premised on a comprehensive, publicly administered, portable, universal, a system of care free at the point of service. Most of the contributors to this volume pay attention to some of the prehistory of the 1968 start of Medicare, but the 3 chapters in this first section remind us that developments in Canada were contingent and contested, and that debates on healthcare financing and delivery have a rich history that drew from a wide variety of international models advocated by different groups and imagined very different endpoints. The second part of the book focuses on omissions, equity, and access. The principles that underlay the construction of the federal Medicare program were straightforward and uncontroversial. Any participating province had to provide services that were universal, comprehensive, portable, and after 1984, accessible. Although these were noble goals to which few Canadians would not lend their assent, in practice they proved to be unattainable, and the obstacles were hardly random, dividing Canadians along lines of race, gender, age, ability, region, and employment status. Numerous authors address these themes, but the 5 chapters in the second section foreground some of the exclusions and inequities. They also highlight the activism of community members who organized, protested, filed lawsuits, and tried to circumvent the barriers to access and to mitigate their worst effects. In general terms, the story of activism for human rights is familiar to Canadian historians, reflecting as it does the civil rights movement in Canada in the 1960s and 70s. However, for all of the successes, and there were successes, progress was always subject to rollbacks, and neoliberal cuts in the 1980s and later further limited gains and on occasion eliminated existing ones. The third part of the book focuses on professional opportunities and reactions. The introduction of Medicare led as well to the emergence of another type of activism, collective advocacy by healthcare professional organizations. From medical associations focused on physicians' remuneration, to the dentist's wholesale rejection of Medicare, to some allied professions' skillful maneuvering between public and private healthcare markets, professional organizations have engaged with Medicare in a variety of ways, and in the process, they have profoundly shaped the landscape of healthcare in Canada. For instance, the benefits of private care, dental care, vision care, prescription drugs, were largely reaped by those in stable, full-time, and particularly union-based employment, thus exposing and amplifying employment-based and other inequities in the Canadian healthcare system. Collectively, the chapters in this third section of the volume lead to an understanding of these tensions within healthcare and society at large since the 1960s, from the federal government's lack of leadership in foregrounding public and preventative health to the ways in which an insufficient number of domestically trained doctors led to a reliance on immigrant doctors who sometimes found their working conditions challenging, but who also responded by envisioning new ways of engaging in collaborative group practice, for instance. So in conclusion, the careful historical work that went into this volume's case studies demonstrates the historical contingency and the rich complexity that animate the history of Canadian Medicare. And we hope that you will enjoy it and find it illuminating and galvanizing for the future work that remains to be done. Thank you.
I'm Esyllt Jones. I'm an editor, but I also have a chapter in the book, and so I want to talk a little bit about the things that I like about the chapter, which was co-written with my colleague Erin Goss, who's here tonight as well. Erin did most of the work in our chapter, which is about a grassroots organization in 1930s and 40s Saskatchewan that advocated for Medicare. Erin did most of the work that looked at the contribution of women activists to that organization, which was called a very unwieldy name, the State Hospital and Medical League, which I like to just refer to as the League, and just because it's a mouthful otherwise. This chapter, I think I'm happy with the choice of this chapter. I also wrote a longer book on the history of advocacy in this period for socialized medicine called Radical Medicine. I like this chapter because it really emphasizes how important were the contributions of ordinary or average or working class or farmer or whatever label you want to use, Canadians, to the conversations around the formation of Medicare. And the League was a group of largely rural and some urban Saskatchewanians who spent years not just getting petitions signed and talking about what government should do, but actually formulating an alternative plan for Medicare. And I think these people were extraordinarily committed not just to that work of mobilizing a vote that was in many ways responsible for the election of the Tommy Douglas government, but also to the intellectual work of developing Medicare. And as Aaron uncovered in his research, some of that intellectual and organizing work was done by women, although women are rarely mentioned in either histories of Medicare from this period or the histories or by the League itself, really. So in all of this, there was a really important emphasis on lay knowledge and lay authority, and the role of ordinary people in conceptualizing and calling for and governing their own healthcare system. And I think that those ideas of the value of the opinions of non-elites are incredibly resonant for us today in the COVID context, when we have confronted this lack of trust that people have in our state and in our healthcare system. And how much we still have yet to go and do on that trust. And I think of somebody that Aaron writes about a lot in the chapter, Sophia Dixon, who was a longtime advocate for the CCF, also for the access to birth control for women, and for socialized medicine. And Sophia Dixon was born in a poor family in Denmark who migrated to Canada. And by the time she was 16, she was working as a school teacher in rural Saskatchewan, helping to support her parents and her siblings. By the time she was 30, she already had several children of her own. And in all of that, she was, you can just sort of picture the young Sophia Dixon who was desperate for learning. Who love to learn, because she's also been referred to, I did a little bit more digging about her recently, referred to as the philosopher of the early CCF, which isn't something that people said about women in the CCF very often. The classical critique of the political left from feminist scholars like Joan Sangster is that, women were never allowed to be seen publicly as being the brain workers of the left. They were always the ones making the coffee and selling the memberships. And so, yeah, they did that too, it turns out. And I just really value the thought of Sophia Dixon, who spent her whole life educating herself and others about, things that we could hope to achieve in Medicare. Many of those things never came to pass, so we still have lots of unfinished work to do, but she played a pivotal role along with other members of the League in the achievement of Canadian Medicare, and I think it's one that deserves our respect and recognition. I just want to finally say what an honor it was to work on this project. James and Delia are just lovely people and so important to me, and I just have spent, 4 years working on it. An edited collection is a labor of love over many years. And so I want to thank them, and also all the contributors to the volume who really made such an effort to bring these stories to light. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mary Jane McCallum, and I'm one of the 17 authors or co-authors of contributing chapters in Medicare Histories. And hello to people online. I know there might be some contributors out there who are watching right now, and there's at least one in the room here as well. So as contributors, we get off easy. So we get to just deliver our chapters to the editors, and then the editors pore over them and tell us how to change our footnotes and make sure that our photos are correct and our all of the everything that goes into an edited collection. It's all their labor. So I just feel really fortunate to be part of this volume and so carefully cared for throughout the process. So I'm a friend and a colleague of Esyllt, James and Delia too, and I have benefited from being a part of a small but productive group of historians of health, medicine, and science that has played a significant role in kind of the founding and shaping of this book. That group is based in Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, and Métis territory, and it crosses the US border as well. So Indigenous history is the founding and continuing history of this territory of North America, and the same can be said for medical history as well. So the institutions of healthcare and practices of them are inextricably linked to Indigenous people, Indigenous land, Indigenous waters, as well as institutions of knowledge that are Indigenous, and particularly the relatedness of people and social and environmental structures. So my chapter with Canadian historian Maureen Lux, we put Medicare into the context of treaty making and treaty relations in Canada. We demonstrate Indigenous resistance to the colonization of health of Indigenous people, lands, and resources, in part through Medicare, from the co-creation of Treaty 6 in 1876, to the kind of sad denial of kind of rights to healthcare, treaty rights to healthcare that happens with the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch, or FINIP, and the NIHB, the Non-Insured Health Benefits Program. So the McCallum family, my family of the 1970s and 80s, wouldn't have liked that last sentence very much. We were told not to really talk very much about benefits or discounts that we received from the state because of our status as Indians, likely as a kind of Indigenous middle-class survival strategy in predominantly white Southern Ontario community that we grew up in. To us and to many others, these were not presented as rights that are grounded in the history of Canada and ourselves, but rather lucky coincidences, that mistakes that could easily be corrected at any moment in time. So I've recently started writing a little bit about Indigenous History Month. If anybody doesn't know, it's Indigenous History Month right now in June. An event that also began in contention and Indigenous state relations and the virulent efforts to terminate Indigenous treaty rights. So it's funny how this event, Indigenous History Month, and then the 21st National Indigenous Peoples Day, this history of treaty rights is all but forgotten in those celebrations. Or, maybe we sort of suspect that it's there, but we kind of don't talk about it too much. Instead, we kind of celebrate the success stories of hardworking individuals instead. But the history of June 21st, National Indigenous Peoples Day, is actually kind of deeply embedded in the constitutional talks of the 1980s and the ways that Indigenous people kind of forced themselves into a kind of partnership with the state in the Constitution. And it wouldn't have happened without the activism of Indigenous people and the knowledge of their history and their relations in Canada. So in the same way, our chapter kind of looks at these individuals who challenged the erasure or termination of treaty rights. And I take these sort of individual cases as kind of a real inspiration. Obviously, I have my inspirational colleagues at school who kind of help me to think critically about healthcare institutions and show me how to follow the surgeons and the physicians and where their archives might be. But I also gain a lot of energy out of learning about these individuals. And I'll tell you about a couple of them now. George Drever, the chief of Mistawassa's First Nation in 1935, sued the federal government to recover banned funds that had been spent on drugs and medical supplies, and won. Walter Johnson, who in 1965, on behalf of a group of First Nations employees of the North Battleford Indian Hospital, refused to pay hospital insurance premiums, arguing that Treaty 6 conferred a right to free healthcare and hospitalization, and won, but lost on appeal. Andrew Swimmer, who in 1968 was charged with failing to pay medical care insurance taxes and won his case because he was a treaty Indian and therefore exempt from paying the tax at the lower court, and then he lost on appeal later on. So many others have resisted in many ways over time. Between 1876 and 1968 and beyond, challenging the federal government when it arbitrarily cuts kind of benefits to First Nations people in terms of healthcare coverage. And I also talked a little bit with Maureen Lux, and she wanted to convey that what she hopes for in the future is more critical investigations of the Treaty 6 and the medicine chest clause part of Treaty 6, that those might come out in the future. So thank you very much.
So much to our panelists. I'm going to ask if you'd like to join up front. We have a wireless mic to that can be used. Yes, they are very high chairs.
I'm terrified.
And while our panelists are coming up, if you in the audience have a question that you would like to ask them, I would invite you to raise your hand. I will repeat the question, and if those of you joining us virtually have questions, you can add them to the chat, and we will be able to answer them in due process. Yes. In the striped, yeah, the pen.
Do I need a mic?
No, I'll repeat the question. Yes.
It's a convoluted question.
Uh-oh.
The short version of it is Medicare progressive or is it conservative? The longer part of the question is Professor Hanley began by dissing Prime Minister Harper for not crowing about this wonderful progressive act. And Delia reminded us that in fact there was lots of gaps. And the Progressive Act didn't quite cover all the people in need. And so I'm wondering within, again, it's part of the Canadian identity. And so is it basically a neoliberal sort of instrument by which corporate entities put on the back of the Canadian public what in your beloved country, the corporations take upon themselves, i.e. the medical insurance of their workers. So sorry for the convolution, but is it Canadian identity? Because it's actually smack in the middle.
No.
Kind of neither this nor that.
So the question for those who are joining us virtually is whether Medicare can be classified as progressive or conservative, given some of the gaps that do exist. And in thinking about the political context, both with Harper, as our first speaker alluded to, as well as some of the gaps that were alluded to by Delia. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. I'm not sure if James, you would like to start, and then Delia and Esyllt.
Sure.
And there's a microphone for those that are joining us virtually.
Hello. Right, I don't think of this in either or terms. It's both and. So it's certainly progressive and it's certainly very problematic at the same time. And I wasn't necessarily dissing the Harper government in those comments, not that I wouldn't in another context, but I think I was dissing a kind of one-dimensional perspective of recognizing Canadian history, which seeks only to stoke nationalism. And unfortunately, Roy, I could not hear the rest of your question, so I can't really go any further than that. I don't know if one of the other panelists wants to.
Yeah, I mean, we refer to this rich, complex history that the volumes, chapters, do such a fantastic job of illustrating. So it's a complicated story, indeed.
The people that I study, especially those who were protesting in the late 60s and 70s, would say no. It was something that tried to assimilate First Nations people, in their words, make white people Indians.
Yeah, I think the thread of dissent is as old as or older than Medicare itself. So, the groups that I study, there's not one opinion necessarily about what the role of the state is in health and the body, maintaining the well-being of the body. And one of the things I actually appreciate about studying these people is that they are themselves unafraid of having these debates. And they see themselves as supporters of a more progressive system that may not deny as many people access as the world that existed before Medicare. They have blinders, of course, you know, settler colonial blinders, but lots of others too. But they're also disagreeing among themselves about what the meaning of that project is. And also once they, in Saskatchewan, for instance, once they form government, it doesn't take long before they're critiquing that government that they fought so hard to elect. And that's the nature of politics. And it's worth thinking about all of those things, because I think it's also different from how we feel ourselves about it.
Other questions from the audience in the room? It's in the back.
Oh, hi. We spoke, Dr. McCallum spoke briefly about 86 in the medicine test class, which many First Nations organizations would describe it as guaranteeing the federal government providing healthcare benefits to all First Nations, and where the federal government might deny the same, or at least not comment on it as they have recently. There's a lot of tension there, I think, Treaty 6 benefits and benefits to Indigenous peoples in Canada. In the context of an increasing drive towards self-determination among many First Nation groups in Canada, Manitoba specifically, Canada in general, and First Nations groups taking on more and more responsibility for delivering healthcare directly, where do you see the conversation around Treaty 6 applications going in the next while? Maybe I'm asking you something a little bit too vague, but do you see this conversation evolving, or do you see this?
That's a great question.
Can I repeat? Yep. And just to make sure the folks online can hear, so within the context of increasing self-governance amongst Indigenous peoples and delivery of healthcare by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit folks for Indigenous people, how is that going to shape discussions around Treaty 6 and the Medicine Chest Clause and the tensions that currently exist there?
I think it's a really good question, because we don't really see much about it in the recent, reports, like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's report. There's a very brief statement by Val Gideon that kind of refers to treaty rights, but then doesn't build upon that at all. And so I think that there's plenty of room, and yeah, I have to say, I'm sorry, I actually don't know what we'll see. But like in education, we don't see much of a discussion of treaty rights education either, like in our post-secondary institutions. So, I think we hopefully will start to relearn this history, and that it'll inform the present. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you for that. Other questions from folks in the audience? So just using some of my host privileges, a question that was occurring to me during the course of the conversation was thinking specifically about some of the gaps that do exist within our Medicare program, and the challenges that historically folks had in getting Medicare up and running. What are some of the lessons that we can learn and maybe take in with us today if we're wanting to expand coverage or go towards things like dental care, et cetera? So are there lessons that can be learned? What actions can be taken? What can we draw on from the past? And I'm gonna go to Delia first, because you started talking a little bit about that in the introduction, and wonder if we could hear from all of the panelists.
Yeah, we have a fantastic chapter in the book about the history of dental care and pharmacare and the lessons we can learn actually from the failure of these two programs. One of the myths that the author tackles in this chapter is that pharmacare will be prohibitively expensive. And I think she does a phenomenal job showing how that's not the case. So that's certainly one way of moving forward.
So for me, the great value of the contributions that all the contributors gave us was showing me how complex and contingent, as Delia had already mentioned in her remarks, this whole history was. And things were on the table at the beginning that just kind of got dropped. And they got dropped for different reasons in different cases. But when I finally read all of the contributions, once they all come in, I felt just empowered by reading how much initiative and activity there was. And even after Medicare passed, and some people were profoundly disappointed with the final product as it emerged, how committed they were to continuing to drive forward the developments both inside and outside Medicare to try to address concerns that are fundamental to the well-being of Canadians. And two of the chapters, that Mary Jane's chapter is an obvious example, but two of the others that come to mind are about initiatives around home care, which was one of the things that was in the mix in the late 1950s, but somehow didn't make the transition into the final program. And the activities of, really essentially volunteers. And the case study in the book is of two Gulf Islands in British Columbia, and a fantastic home care program that was set up and that could, provide the essential supports that are needed to keep people well, even if they don't happen to be suffering from a particular illness that needs medical treatment. And the second example that came to mind was the work of disability rights activists in Ontario and fighting to get assistive devices somehow covered by the state. The Ontario government made sure that they never covered it under OHIP, so they could continue to charge people a copay to get these devices, which they would be provided with for free if they got them in the hospital. But they never gave up fighting for that and had successes in the early 1980s, and the program has continued to expand. So for me, the lesson is that, and certainly this echoes remarks that Esyllt made this morning on CBC, people just have to keep fighting because it certainly won't happen otherwise.
Yeah, one of the chapters we haven't talked about a lot in the book is, well, there are a couple. One of them is on the history of nursing leadership engagement in Medicare, which is one I think about a lot these days, given the nursing crisis that we're facing, written by Kate McPherson from New York University. And one of her points in that essay is about, at the moment at which the federal Medicare program was created, nurses had really put themselves at the table where key discussions were happening. But then when the system was introduced, they found themselves subsumed into hospital budgets without a separate accounting for what nurses did. And that simple decision has had decades of consequences. So physicians bill fee for service and they charge for their services, but nurses are just part of the hospital budget. And of course, this is very gendered, but it also wasn't at all what women, nursing leaders expected to have happen at that moment. So they had done years and years of advocacy, most of it in support of Medicare for decades. And then when it all kind of is realized, they're sort of kept out of a certain way of counting. And if any of you are familiar with the idea of, how women don't get counted in general in economies, it's the same with nursing. The other piece that that I think has a lot to teach us is the chapter on public health. And the challenge is that, again, that you know, the moment when public health in the early 80s and into the 90s became kind of an orthodoxy in a certain way, where there was this apparent or seeming embrace of more prevention. So ideas like the social determinants of health or health promotion. But often these were used as kind of an underpinning for reducing the costs of Medicare, because there were significant cost drivers in Medicare, hospitalization being at that time the biggest one. Now it's, you know, also things like medications and high-tech surgical procedures. But you know, rather than a genuine embrace of prevention, the prevention was sort of a thing that might be used to provide an ideological cover for the reduction of spending on healthcare services. And that really, you know, I think took the wind out of the sails of what was actually a transnational movement for more progressive public health approaches that genuinely factored in people's social and economic circumstances in thinking about health, which is an idea we still talk about all the time, and yet it has become in the interim really quite empty. And Heather traces some of that history in the book. Something to, I think, now that we have to sort of return to is finding a way to structure public health that's genuinely going to solve some of the barriers and problems that we see for people who are kind of, you know, post-COVID or are in a situation where they may not be as supportive of public health as they were in the abstract.
Other questions from the audience? And somebody gave me their phone so I could look at the chat, and unfortunately it froze, so I might be missing some chat questions. I apologize. Sorry about that. Any other questions from the group? Esyllt, you started talking just a little bit about the gendered nature of healthcare, and I was really curious about some of the discoveries that Aaron and you made during the course of studying the history that took place in Saskatchewan and the gendered nature just of the movement itself. I wonder if either of you would be willing to speak a little bit more to that.
Do you want to? No, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think when we get to a slightly later period when debates about the relationship between women and Medicare are part of later feminist movements, there's a slightly different conversation that happens there. And that's a difficult, critical conversation too. Whitney Wood has a chapter in the book that talks about the relationship between hospitalized birth and Medicare and the increase in interventions in birth. And you know, she's someone in the collection who is quite critical of that process. It's not necessarily a process that's just specific to Medicare, but we have an insured health system in Canada that has not, especially, you know, up until fairly recent years, has not really respected the rights of women in birth, women and families. So there are lots of gender struggles that characterize Medicare debates for sure, and we talk about some of those.
Yes.
Can you say more about where you hope research will go after this? Like what Senator Volume is potentially setting up in terms of what stories still need to be told, either by you all or other historians?
So the question from the floor was, based on the work that you did, where do you see this history going? What further work might come out of this collection of volume? What stories need to be told?
while I can contribute to the volume, so I can really speak to that. I'm sure all of the various contributors have different ways that they hope to extend their research agenda. A number of the chapters in the book are case studies, and they made me think a lot about, well, what else was happening in some other province or some other part of that province. And so many of these stories to me were new and really will transform the way that I teach the history of Medicare. That there's, you know, the kind of conventional story is well known in the Saskatchewan and the 1960s. And there's so many other stories that for whatever historical subject you're interested in, but certainly in this history of Medicare, that need to be fleshed out, because I think knowledge of the richness of the past is, to me, it's by itself empowering. And so I hope that that work continues to be done by not just our contributors, but people who read the volume and get interested in the history of care in Canada. I don't really know if that answers the question you were asking.
I think that Maureen Lux would say, you know, she wants more histories of treaty and how treaty relations kind of inform early medical services. The work that I'm doing studies racially segregated Indian hospitals. So this is the siphoning off of Indian health services as a federal responsibility versus provincial, kind of the growth of the provincial hospital system in the 20th century. So I think that understanding our health history as a racialized one is going to be something that we that is really important. So one of the things that we tried to do was to add anti-racism as a pillar to the Canada Health Act, sort of pushed for that kind of stuff. And that really, like we sort of dropped that. I don't know if they're really going to go for that kind of thing, to have like a really profound kind of discussion of racism and the structures of Medicare and health in Canada. But I think those recent cases of Brian Sinclair and Joyce Echaquan have obviously, you know, made a lot of Canadians kind of rethink the systems that they kind of relied on as being quote unquote universal. So that may be something that we see in the future.
I just want to say quickly, because I've started working on a project on community health in Manitoba. There is almost no history of Medicare in Manitoba. Someone could write that.
With that statement, I'm going to, oh, sorry.
No. That was a great question.
Oh, okay. We were totally at a hard 8 o'clock, and I wanted to give folks time to interact with the panelists after this. So I'm going to thank everyone for attending, thank our panelists, and encourage everyone to go and get your book and get it signed. So thank you so much.
Yes, indeed. Thank you all so very much for your attention. We'll now move along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll ask you to remain seated for just one moment, and we'll be relocating those who will be signing the book just to a cash desk beside, or just to a table beside our cash desk. The store is technically closed, but rest assured that you will not be closed for you folks. We ask that you just remain around that immediate area if you'd be so kind, and then please feel free to take your time and have your book signed. Copies of the book are available at the central cash desk. They're also available at the signing table. You can get them signed first if you'd like. Just please do remember to pay for the book at some point tonight. And I'd like to thank all of you here physically and joining us virtually. Thank you all so very much for being here tonight. Thank you to the University of Manitoba Press. And please join me one more time in thanking tonight's.